Lucky, damn lucky.
Tremendous pleasure it is for me to be here with you. Actually, at this stage, I'm happy to be anywhere, but especially here with the Military Order of World Wars. I went back and checked my records and discovered that I addressed this group, restaurant. I think it was a barbecue restaurant somewhere over on Harry Hines. Yes, before you had these lovely facilities here at the Park Cities Club. But I wanted to speak to you today particularly from my heart, because I am, as a member of the so-called greatest generation, which I think is a great exaggeration, by the way, but nevertheless, my generation, those few of us who are still here, and there are very few, are really concerned about our nation and the state of our affairs. Now, I'm not going to get into a political debate, but I want to tell you that when we as youngsters pledged allegiance to our country, to put our lives on the line, we agreed that we would defend our Constitution and our values against all enemies, both foreign and domestic. And my friends, today, unfortunately, we are concerned that we are being betrayed from within. Take that to heart. And remember it when you get in the voting booth, if you please. Okay, I want to give you a little synopsis of where I served, when I served, and how I served. One of the things this order supports wholeheartedly is the R.O.T.C. And as a high schooler, my best friend and I were members of the R.O.T.C. unit at Chattanooga High School. He was the regimental commander, and I was the commander of one of the 2 battalions. When we graduated from high school, we were very conscious of the war clouds over Europe and what was happening around on the other side of the world. And we thought it would be the smartest thing, since we both wanted to learn to fly, and discovered that the United States Army Air Corps, as it was known then, required 2 years of college, which we didn't have. So we thought it was the coolest thing that we could do would be to go to Canada and join the Royal Canadian Air Force and learn to fly, get our commissions, wings, and then once America became involved, as we were sure it was going to do, we could transfer to our service, and we'd be a step ahead of all our buddies. Sounded pretty smart to me. So we applied, and the Canadian Air Force said, "We'll welcome you with both arms. We'd love to train you. Here's the application." which they forwarded to us, and we filled out eagerly. And at the bottom it said, since you're underage, you must have parental consent. Uh-oh. So we went to my best friend Sally Sullivan's mother. He was an only child. His father had been mustard gassed in the First World War. He never knew him. But he was all his mother had. And she listened very attentively and said, well, Sully, if you really feel that this is something you must do, then you have my blessing. So I naturally thought if I went home and told my parents, I'd receive much the same result. My mother did accept the fact that Mrs. Sullivan was willing to allow her only offspring to go to Canada and learn to fly, and fly for the Canadians. And so she said, well, I hate to see you do this, but if you must, I'm not going to stand in your way. But you have to convince your father. So when Dad came home, he heard the plan. And he said, you blithering idiots don't have a clue as to what you're getting into and what you're doing. This is none of your business. It's a war between other entities, other countries, and you get back in school. Over my dead body would I give you my consent. So Sully went to Canada, and I went to college. Subsequently, as we all know, Pearl Harbor occurred, and then there wasn't any question about my service. I didn't need parental consent. My fraternity brothers and I, almost en masse, marched down to the recruiting station and signed up. I signed up as an aviation cadet, because in those days, if you volunteered, then you could choose the branch of service in which you served. And so I chose the Air Force, or the Air Corps, and went into training and succeeded in graduating along with 40 of my classmates. And then something happened that has never happened in any other group in the Air Force. They took 40 members of my class along with me and immediately sent us to Kearney, Nebraska, where the 100th Bomb Group, a B-17 outfit, had already been through pre-combat training, was ready to ship out overseas, and they pulled all of the co-pilots out and put us in the right seat. Fresh out of twin-engine flying school, we'd never been in a B-17. I guess you call that military intelligence, don't you? Well, anyway, nobody has ever discovered who ordered that or why. And it only happened in the 100th Bomb Group. So when this docuseries that many of you probably have seen, called Masters of the Air, produced by Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg, was proposed and released, I was very interested to see how they might treat such fact as that about the Bloody Hundredth Bomb Group, as it became known. They didn't even touch it. I don't know why. But nevertheless, out of that 40, as Winston said, 4 of us completed a tour. We found ourselves going overseas immediately against an extremely formidable German Air Force known as the Luftwaffe. And they knew what they were doing. They were professionals. They had been fighting for 4 years when we got to England. They had the best equipment, they had the best Air Force, bar none, in the world. They'd been there. They'd fought the Russians on the Eastern Front and the British on the Western, and their backs were to the wall. The Nazis had occupied all of Europe, totally. So the minute we crossed the channel, we were over enemy territory, playing in their backyard. Now, only completely unbeknownst to us as airmen was the fact that the British, who had been badgering President Roosevelt for 2 years to get America involved, but he didn't have the support of the American people, so he couldn't do it. And he knew that the Japanese were going to attack us. That's been proven. He just didn't know when, and he didn't know where. But Pearl Harbor gave him that excuse. And so what none of you, because you weren't born then, know, is that what Pearl Harbor did to America was galvanize it into action. We were so united as a country. Every single person, from grandchildren to grandparents, were involved. The kids were taught how to plant victory gardens. The older people went into the factories and outproduced the world for not only ourselves, but for all of our allies. And the world has never seen such production. We didn't know we could do it, but we did. Nor did we as soldiers, as raw recruits, citizen soldiers, did we know what we could do until we were forced to do it. And so that's why I say today that if you think the current generation couldn't measure up as we did, you don't know that. And they don't know that. Because you really don't know what you can do until you're asked to do it or forced to do it by being attacked. Anyway, I'd like to give you a real close and quick synopsis of the. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Or do I need the microphone? Okay. All right. I don't know whether you all are all familiar with the B-17 or not, which is what I was assigned to fly. The B-17 was a heavy bomber, 4 engines, 10-man crew, a bombardier in the nose, a navigator, a pilot and a co-pilot. Back of them was a top turret gunner, the crew chief. Back of that was the bomb bay was the radio operator, gunner, and below, that little bulb below was called a belly turret. The belly turret was manned by the smallest man on the crew invariably, and a heck of a position. And then above him were two waist gunners. This was a V-17F that you see the picture of here. And it shows closed windows in the waist. They took those out and mounted 50 caliber machine guns in each of them. And those poor devils had to stand there in that open window in the wind and the unbelievable cold because we were unpressurized at 25 to 29,000 feet that we flew and bombed.
Wow.
The temperature was, even in the summertime, minus 50 to 60 degrees below zero. This impacted our ability to function so profoundly that we nearly froze to death. Half of our wounded in the hospitals were from frostbite, the other half from battle damage. But those were conditions that we had to endure for hours on end. Some of our missions were 10 hours long. We could be up there 6 hours. My only physical injury in the 25 missions that I flew was frostbitten feet. On one mission, I got a piece of shrapnel that penetrated the plexiglass nose and sent a cold jet of air directly at my feet. And I couldn't move them. I had to have my feet on the rudders. And they froze there solidly. So when I got back, they had to chip me out of the airplane, send me to the hospital, pack my feet in ice, and gradually restore them to normal temperature. And I'm just extremely fortunate that I didn't lose all of my toes or more. Because if one of those waist gunners that I mentioned, standing in that open window, took off his gloves, he could lose all of his fingers to the nearest digit. He wouldn't feel any pain, he wouldn't see any blood. He wouldn't know it until he saw his fingers on the floor. But those are conditions that we had to endure. Doing this day after day, getting back in that airplane after you've been injured or you've lost some of your crew members was something that I frequently get asked, how in the world did you do that? You know what? I don't know. I just know that peer pressure and the fact that we were focused on what we were doing, the job we were sent there to do, and continue to do it, kept us going. That is most of us, not all. Sometimes some crew members, or maybe a whole crew, would become so battle weary that we'd have to withdraw them from combat and send them to a rest home. Remove them completely from the war for maybe a week or 10 days and let them get a whole new perspective and hopefully recharge their batteries and come back and continue to fly. They didn't always do that. But if not, they had to be removed immediately. Sadly enough, in combat, in aerial combat, when a crew goes down and fails to return from a mission, there is no memorial. There's no funeral. There's no mention. Their personal belongings are backed up and they're shipped out immediately, and a replacement crew takes their place. That's just the way it works. But those are things and conditions under which we met the enemy full face. The British begged us not to go out in the broad daylight. They said it's suicidal. We've tried it. The Germans are too good. They have air superiority over all of Europe, and they'll cut you to ribbons. But our commanders, unbeknownst to us, said, no, that's what we trained these boys to do. That's what our equipment is designed to do, with or without fighter escort. Initially, we had none. There were no fighters in the European theater. The British would escort us to the enemy coast, and then they were out of fuel, and they had to come back and refuel. So we were out bare against an enemy that was very, very effective. They were fighting for their homeland, and they were tenacious. They were extremely aggressive. There was also another, well, to finish the crew, there is a tail gunner with twin 50 calibers back there in the tail. And we also had a B-24, which was a heavy bomber. And we had one division of those in the 8th Air Force in England, but two divisions of B-17s. And so the B-17 really bore the brunt of the battle. And that's why it's known as the Flying Fortress. And being built by Boeing, the 17 could withstand more battle damage than the 24 and still fly. I think I used up 6 airplanes in the course of my tour, but that never flew again. But and one of the first things I did when I got home, being so impressed with the way Boeing put together their airplanes, is I went out and bought some Boeing stock. Made some money too. But at any rate, that's the cockpit of the B-17, which had a very peculiar throttle quadrant. Those red things there was an ingenious design to control the 4 engines, but Boeing never used it on another airplane. This is how the waist gunners, with all of the equipment that they had to wear, and you had to, of course, be on oxygen or you couldn't exist above 10,000 feet. But you'll notice the gunner on the right is almost ankle deep in spent cartridges. And those were a hazard because it made standing and maneuvering, following incoming fighters, a very treacherous activity. And sometimes I've asked, well, in close formation, how did those gunners keep from shooting down people in their own formation? Well, sadly, they didn't always. It did happen. They would be tracking an incoming fighter and forget that there were others in the formation, and suddenly a plane would go down to friendly fire. That, unfortunately, was part of the cost that we paid. These are formations that we used when I was in England. That red star, if you can see it there, was a city called Thorpe Abbotts, which is where the Bloody Hundredth was based. It was 4 minutes from the enemy coast by air, and they never moved. In the 2 years that they were in the European theater, they never moved to another base. These were the so-called escort fighters that we had. I call them so-called because we didn't always see them. It depended upon very precise timing that they would rendezvous with us. The theory and the strategy of fighters escorting bombers was fallacious on the face of it. And why? Because they were twice as fast as the bombers. And in order to stay with us, they had to orbit the whole formation, and they burned up fuel. So they couldn't last very long. They'd have to go back, and the Germans would just wait until they left, and then they'd jump us. Theoretically, another group of escorts would come up and take their place. But that depended upon very precise timing and a lot of logistics that didn't always work out. They looked good on paper, but they didn't work out in practice. So those were things that we contended with. We had P-47s, the Thunderbolt. We also had the P-51 Mustang, which eventually they equipped with long-range drop tanks, and that helped. We had some P-38s in the theater, but we seldom ever saw them. And I don't remember them ever escorting us. The Germans, in the meantime, were confronting them with Messerschmitt 101, 109s, Focke-Wulf 190s, and a twin-engine rocket ship, the Messerschmitt 110, which was a real hazard because they could sit out of gun range and lob rockets into the formation and wreak havoc. I wanted to show you here briefly, that was just the range of some of the fighters. This is some of the damage that the B-17 could withstand. And still fly. That one had the nose shot off of it, and the instrument panel was gone, and the pilot was stuck his head out the side window, and that's the only way he landed that airplane. And you'll notice that white thing underneath the nose was a chin turret. That was a later model, the B-17G, which thwarted the head-to-head or dead-on attacks of the Germans, where they would get out line of rest 3 or 4 miles in front of the formation and fly directly through us. Now that rate of closure between the two forces at altitude was something like 500 miles an hour. So things happened extremely fast. And little did we know, but there were only 4-second intervals when their guns would bear on us and our guns would bear on them. The rest of the time they were overshooting or undershooting, and so were we. But they'd fly directly through us, and boy, they would wreak damage just untold. At the end of the war, the Germans perfected the jet. At the top of that picture is the Messerschmitt 163, which was literally a flying bomb, a guided missile. They lost an awful lot of pilots because it was just simply, it had a, it didn't have a landing gear, it just had a skid on the bottom. That trolley, the wheels, as it would take off, it would get about 50 feet in the air and it would drop those wheels, and they would bounce up and a lot of times knock the airplane out of the air. But it was capable of going to 30,000 feet and then pointing straight down. It was out of fuel. That's all the fuel it had. And dive through the formation one time and take all the airplanes it could with it at the time. Now, at the bottom of the picture here is the Messerschmitt 262 twin-engine jet, which the Germans did perfect before anybody else in the world. And that was unknown to anybody. It was faster, it was more deadly, it was more advanced technologically than anything else flying. And had the Germans, had Hitler and Goering, Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, used it properly, it would have changed the outcome of the war, because we didn't have anything that was even remotely comparable to it. The Fuhrer and Goering could not agree. Goering was a World War I fighter pilot, and he insisted that the Fuhrer let him use that as a fighter. But Hitler had other ideas. He thought it was a fighter bomber. And so that's the way they employed it. And because of that miscalculation and one other miscalculation, they lost the war. The other miscalculation they made was that Hitler never believed that we could replace our losses. He was so sure that he could inflict such heavy damage upon us that we could never recover. But we fooled him. We outproduced the world. Or you and I wouldn't be here. Well, that's just briefly my experience in the war. And I'd like to take a minute or two, if you'd like, and answer any questions that you might have. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Major, was the, you said you had 40 people in that original class, 40 cadets in your original class.
Well, there were 40 of the class. There were more in the class,
Yeah,
but that
so
was
that's
all.
40 that were in your group.
Yes, sir.
How many of them made it back safely after the war? Only 4 out of 40? The other 36 were either KIA or they were POWs?
Or dead.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Your odds of survival in the European theater in early 1943, when we went to the war, were 1 in 4. Before we went overseas, the commander officer called us together and he said, "Gentlemen, look to your right, look to your left, look ahead and look behind you. Only one of you is going to come home. You're dead. You might as well accept it. But you got a job to do." And that's how we went to war.
So I want to know what kind of training you got as a kid or somewhere that has enabled you, one, to have such a positive attitude, and secondly, live to be 102.
Okay, the first question was, what kind of training did we have to have the right attitude, I guess you might call it.
Even as a kid.
As a kid as well.
Well, the training was conventional training, if we got it. But we didn't get any training. When we got sent to the 100th Bomb Group as newly minted pilots, we were coming out of twin-engine training planes, never been in a B-17. And the group was ready to go overseas, so we had to learn from our pilot, or on the job, as they call it in the military, on the job training. And that's a heck of a way to go to war, believe me. But if you want to know what I owe my longevity of 102 years of life, Scotch. Yes, ma'am.
So the German pilots who piloted the Messerschmitt 163 were literally volunteering or accepting orders for a suicide mission.
I'm sorry, my hearing is so...
I'll give this to her, and then I'll bring it back to you.
okay, thank you.
I was asking you if the pilots of the German Messerschmitt 163 were literally volunteering or being ordered to take on a suicide mission.
Absolutely. And also, the Germans flew until they died. They didn't have a tour. They didn't have any relief at all. They might get a week leave or a break occasionally if they were really showing some battle fatigue, but normally they flew and flew and flew and flew.
Got one question to Joe here. Joe.
Sir, you had mentioned before that your class went into the right seat of the bomber. You didn't mention the right seaters, the co-pilots. They move over, become pilots in this squadron?
Yes.
Pilots?
As a co-pilot, you eventually graduate to first pilot and get a crew. I flew 21 missions with the same crew that I went over with. The crew to which I was assigned, and I might add briefly that when they pulled all of the co-pilots out, these guys had already trained as a team for 4 months prior to going overseas. And to take the second in command of the crew off suddenly and replace it with some knucklehead that didn't know anything about the airplane or the crew was asinine. But they did it. And we some of the crews were very reticent to accept that. My crew was one of those, and they made my life hell. They wanted me to resign or to ask for a transfer. Heaven knows what they would have gotten in their place, but nevertheless, they loved their previous co-pilot, the navigator and the bombardier in particular. And they loved him so much that they couldn't stand me. So you're policing your backfield while you're going into battle. That's a heck of a way to live.
Okay, we got one more question, and then from Joe.
Lucky, just want to find out, the largest group that you had assembled at one time took off and flew together as a battery over the...
All right, the question is, what was the largest group that we ever mounted on a single raid? And while I was there, it increased later because I finished in February of '44, and the war went on for another year. But while I was there, the largest air armada that we launched was 1,000 bombers, plus about 900 fighters. So it was almost 2,000 airplanes. Now that's another thing I would point out to you, that because the weather in Europe is miserable. Cold, foggy, rain, dismal, and terrible to fly in. You had to fly on instruments. And we lost a lot of airplanes in mid-air collisions in the clouds. People would get vertigo and be upside down and think they were right side up, couldn't fly instruments properly. And so we had our share of losses from those circumstances too. But that was the largest. Later on, they doubled that.
So where can we find your books?
Okay, you can get the books from most bookstores, Barnes & Noble or Amazon. You can order it, or you can order it from 100thbg.com, which is the 100th Bomb Group. They sell them as well.
We'll put it on the website.
And those of you who may have books with you today, I'd be happy to sign them before I leave.
And
Well, I want to thank you for your rapt attention. It's been a pleasure to meet you and share my experiences. I have to admit that after a certain period of time on the lecture circuit, I got weary, and I told my then wife of 71 years that I was tired and I was going to hang it up. And she said, "No, you can't. You have to tell the younger generations what you experienced." So as long as I can, I will. Thank you.
before you go, we got something for you. So Lucky turned 102, and we got a cake for him.
Oh, I didn't know whether I got enough breath.
So we'll put it in. Sing happy birthday. So let's sing.
Thank
happy
you.
Birthday. Can we sing happy birthday? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Lucky. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you so much. Come have a piece of cake.
So first, I want to have you take photo of this, the youngest.
Real quick,
Real quick.
before that, sir,
Oh, a challenge coin.
I'm sure you're very familiar with the tradition.
Yes.
They
Thank-
say never to meet your heroes, but whoever said that, I never want to meet.
Thank you so
It's an
much.
honor, and
Thank you.
I look forward to building on that
Thank
legacy.
you. How old are you?
18, sir.
18. Bless your heart.